So far in the book of Esther, we have seen God's providence shine like a diamond's brilliance. Like the glorious glare of the different angles of a diamond, so is God's silent sovereignty seen with each turn of events in the kingdom. From the removal of Vashti as queen to the initiative to find a new one with a decree, all of these randomly moving parts are deemed to be divinely hidden plots. Not only is this true with Esther being made queen, but it's also seen when Mordecai discovers a plot to kill the king. Then there is Haman's wicked scheme to annihilate all the Jews. Little does he know that Queen Esther is one too. So out of the many lessons we have learned thus far in Esther, it is apparent how the Lord's providence moves like chess, not checkers. From the king's sleepless night to Haman's gallows being made overnight, both happenings would prove God's timing is always right. You see, no weapon formed against God's people will prosper. This means that with every dark backdrop comes the setting for the diamond of the gospel. This is Esther, silent sovereignty.
All right, so the video actually does a pretty good job to review where we've been thus far. But if I was to look at the 9 chapters thus far and put a preface before the 9 chapters, a preface would be in the beginning of a book that would hold the content of scope and subject. Prefaces are much shorter, but it's the author's intention. Before you get into the chapters, he's like, this is what I want you to see. What is the preface of Esther? Well, it's all leading to this one chapter that will introduce us to what is known as the Feast of Purim. Long form for Pur. Purim would be this idea behind the Persian word lot. Why is that significant? Because in chapter 3, it was Haman's casting of the lots, which was an omen, which was a way to tell the fortune or fate of a decision. He cast the lot landed, and it picked a date on the calendar that was 12 months later. So about a year later is the day that Haman, according to chapter 3, would designate for the annihilation of the Jews. A decree that the king himself co-signed, unaware of what? That his very own queen was a Jew herself. And the other hidden plots within the chapters, all of which lead to chapter 9, where, of course, the previous chapter, Mordecai and Esther, they sign a counter decree that counteracts the evil of Haman's decree. Both are going to collide on a singular day in time. We look at the outcome in advance. That's the beauty of being able to read it. And we see that the Jews are victorious, to which they take the word Pur and they create a festival or a feast or a holiday out of it, and they call it Purim, which is awesome because they took the original intention of an evil man and the Lord allowed them to recycle it to bring good to the people. So I want to put that at the forefront of your mind because it's going to come up later, and at least you have a context of what that word or that feast means. Now, Haman is dead. He's been so since the end of chapter 7. If you recall chapter 8, when it begins, we're placed 2 months after that original decree was signed. 2 months, Mordecai and Esther waited. Haman's gone. Mordecai has received the honor of Haman. He's promoted. Esther has received the house of Haman. The king's aware that his number one advisor devised the plot against his own queen and her people. He's hung on the very gallows that he made for Mordecai. 2 months pass. Perhaps Mordecai and Esther are looking at each other day by day and going, what are we going to do about the decree? It's still active. The time is counting. Mordecai must have said to Esther, go back and tell the king. To which chapter 8 reveals she gets prostrate and she begs the king to do something about the evil plan of Haman. He says, you have the authority to which Mordecai and Esther document and decree a counter decree. It's a copy and paste. They look at what Haman documented and they literally write it in the same way, except they add a few different qualifications. It's for the Jews. The Jews on that day can defend themselves. So you can't reverse it, but they do inverse it. And on that day, every Jew is allowed to protect their property and their people. It's an interesting concept, only because the evil that Haman did not die with him. Oh no. There's wickedness and unrighteousness and evil in this world that echoes well beyond the life that practiced it. I mean, that's just reality. Even Hitler's evil echoes well beyond what he accomplished in Nazi Germany. But there's a hope and there's a promise for the believer, for the Christian, for the church, and it's this, that the echo of evil, yes, it may resound on earth, but the gates of Hades, they will not prevail against the church. So whatever the enemy has conspired to persecute or oppose the church, Jesus himself said, those efforts will not succeed. So what is the role of the church in the midst of all of this? In the midst of evil echoing, even in our own land? I'll tell you, you must carry forth the torch of truth. That's your role and goal. Individually, as a community, each of us need to carry forth the torch of truth. Like the Statue of Liberty in Ellis Island. Picture that. That's a landmark. Everybody knows what it stands for. Lady Liberty holding a torch. And I'm going, wow. Imagine if the Christian's life was like the Statue of Liberty. That when people see you holding forth the word of life, because that's what Paul called it, they would be attracted to what you say you have and believe. And this is what the Lord uses to draw people to himself, to which Jesus said, let your light so shine before men that they may see your good works and glorify your Father in heaven. The only way to have your life be a statue of liberty is if you follow the statutes of liberty. So it all comes back to the book, knowing the word of God and the statutes that the Lord has entrusted to us and given to us to walk out day by day, individually, where God has placed me for such a time as this. And guess what? Collectively, as a body of believers, where he's placed us for such a time as this. So to the book we look, Esther 9, verses 1 and 2. Now in the 12th month, that is the month of Adar, on the 13th day, another time stamp, the time came for the king's command and his decree to be executed. On the day that the enemies of the Jews had hoped to overpower them, the opposite occurred, in that the Jews themselves overpowered those who hated them. The Jews gathered together in their cities throughout all the provinces of King Ahasuerus to lay hands on those who sought their harm. And no one could withstand them because fear of them fell upon all people. Okay, stop. The first thing to note is about 9 months has passed from the completion of Esther 8 to the beginning of Esther 9. 9 months. What were the Jews likely doing? They're preparing for this day. The day where there would literally be a civil war throughout the 127 provinces in the Persian Empire, where the Jews and their livelihood was going to be threatened by the enemies of the Jews. There was an anti-Semitic attitude that was permeating throughout the empire, throughout the known world, really, to which Haman is the complete epitome of that hatred towards the Jews. But on that very day, the Jews were allowed to protect themselves, self-defense. Notice in verse 2 it says, they were to lay hands on those who sought them harm. That is not the Pentecostal form of laying of hands. Oh no, they're allowed to protect themselves and their property and their people. But more than that, some of the things that struck me were the enemy of the Jews sought to overpower them, but the opposite occurred. And not because the Jews outnumbered them. The enemies of the Jews could not withstand them because fear fell upon them. And I'm going, wow, is this the first time this has happened with the people of God? Oh no. God said to Moses, when you're going through the wilderness on your way to the land I've promised you, Canaan, which would eventually be Israel, this is what God said he would do. Deuteronomy chapter 2, verse 25. This day I will begin to put the dread and fear of you upon the nations under the whole heaven. God's like, hey, all the nations that might be adversarial or in opposition towards you, I'm going to put fear in their hearts about you. Who shall hear the report of you and tremble and be in anguish because of you. Like, this is what God did for his people. Fast forward, they take the land under the generalship of Joshua. They send spies into the land. They encounter a prostitute named Rahab in the city wall. She says to them, Joshua 2, 9-11, I know that the Lord has given you the land, that the terror of you has fallen on us, and that all the inhabitants of the land are faint-hearted because of you. For we have heard how the Lord dried up the water of the Red Sea for you when you came out of Egypt, and what you did to the two kings of the Amorites who were on the other side of the Jordan, Sihon and Og, whom you utterly destroyed. And as soon as we heard these things, our hearts melted. Neither did there remain any more courage in anyone because of you. For the Lord your God, he is God in heaven above and on earth beneath. That's Rahab. That is a Gentile speaking to the God of Israel and saying, we've heard about your God. And the fear of you and your God has fallen on us. Did you catch that in verses 1 and 2? The fact that no one could withstand them. Why? Because the Lord was standing with them. Don't miss that. Remember, the name of God is not mentioned once in the book of Esther, but his nature is written through the pages as clear as day. The only way the fear of the people would be on the enemies of the Jews is if God was the one working and standing behind them. Now, that's not just a truth for Israel. That's a truth for you and I, because you too are Israel, not in the national sense, in the spiritual sense. The meaning of Israel means governed by God, and the church of Jesus Christ and the Christian absolutely is to be governed by God. So what I'm saying in regards to the Jews, I'm saying in regards to you. And Paul would take that exact idea and he would pen it to the Romans chapter 8, verse 31. He would say, if God is for you, you finish it, church. Who can be against you? If God stands with you, what can man do to you? If God's plan for your life, and you realize it, what can the enemy do to thwart it or stop it? He can't. Now, significant here in Esther 9, and even in our present day history with little old Israel. Did you know that the United Nations presently has had more resolutions or sanctions against the tiny nation of Israel than against all member nations combined? In one sampling, that's 200 to 20. 200 against Israel to about 20 to the surrounding countries. By the way, all of which are Arab and hostile towards Israel, which is about the size of yours truly, New Jersey. So there they are, tucked, embedded on a map, surrounded by Arab nations, to name a few, Egypt to the south, Syria to the north, Jordan to the east, Iraq, Iran, Russia to the north. To go a little bit further, one of the ambassadors, part of the permanent mission of Israel to the United Nations, so their representation to the United Nations said this: The Human Rights Council has, in fact, passed more resolutions against Israel than all other countries combined. Between the Arab group, 22 countries. The Organization of the Islamic Conference, 56 countries. And the non-aligned movement, 118 members, all of whom vote consistently against Israel, irrespective of the facts on the ground. Israel's condemnatory treatment in the halls of the United Nations is virtually assured. What's your point? Here's my point. An enemy of Israel is an enemy of God. And that's biblical. That does not mean we support the current disorganization of their government presently, or even some of the evil that takes place in the land. But by and large, that land, biblically speaking, literally speaking, prophetically speaking, is the Jews. The capital being Jerusalem. Now, whether you know this or not, this very dynamic is playing out in our day and age. In fact, we are about to watch a war break out in the Middle East. Same players are involved. Same players from Esther. The Persian Empire, they're just now called Iran. Iran wants to annihilate the Jews. And they have Putin to the north in Russia, who's an advocate of Turkey and Syria. Some of these other allies, even Egypt and Jordan at this point, they're still on the fence. It's something to watch today as it all unfolds. In verse 3-5, it's similar but different. Watch this. All the officials of the provinces, the satraps, the governors, and all those doing the king's work helped the Jews because the fear of Mordecai fell upon them. No doubt, the fear of Mordecai, he's being raised to such a position of prominence. He's replaced Haman, but the queen is Jew. So if you're working in the kingdom and you were loyal to Haman and you find out Haman's dead and the queen's a Jew and Mordecai's a Jew, I'm pretty sure you're going to change teams rather quickly. But it's interesting to note that even the governmental authorities throughout the kingdom are helping this effort with the Jews. For Mordecai was great in the king's palace, and his fame spread throughout all the provinces. For this man, Mordecai, became increasingly prominent. Thus the Jews defeated all their enemies with the stroke of the sword, with slaughter and destruction, and did what they pleased with those who hated them. Now, that is not a statement that says they were revengeful. That's a statement that said that they had their way with their enemies. Like a knife cutting through butter. As smoothly as that occurred, these several verses are alluding to the Jews winning, even though they were outnumbered, even though the enemy sought to destroy them. This is not just contained in the book of Esther, chapter 9. In fact, some of you in this room were alive when this very same dynamic occurred. And it's known as the War of 1967, aka the 6-Day War. If you are old enough to remember, as the world stopped and waited to watch the soon annihilation of the Jews. This was only 19 years after their birth, May 14th, 1948. What you might not know is when these Arab nations surrounded Israel in the early days of June 1967, on June 5th, every border covered with Egyptians and Syrians and Jordanians, with the backing of the Soviet Union at the time. America didn't want to touch it, so they didn't start a World War III. Little tiny Israel was left to fend for herself. So in the greater miracle, we know history tells us they won, but the tinier, smaller, meticulous miracles on day one, a preemptive airstrike from the Israeli Air Force. They took to the air as they flew on their way to strike the Egyptian air bases. The Jordanian Air Force caught them on their radars. They signaled to the Egyptians to let them know the Israelis are on their way. However, the day before, the Egyptians changed their frequencies. So even though the Jordanians were calling and signaling and warning them, it never made it. So Israel was able to strike and destroy all their air bases. That was in Egypt, and it was replicated in Syria. Many military strategists say the war was won within that first hour. Unprecedented, unbelievable. Many who have looked at it have said there's no way Israel could have done what they did. Oh, but it gets better. On that same day, towards the Sinai and some of the other channels, they were being closed in on by the Egyptians and the Syrians on foot. And somehow, some way, the reports came back, the Israeli army was able to go right through them, making their way back, which would eventually set up day 2. On day 2, as the Israeli army was making their way to certain locations, they would hear explosions in advance. They would continue. When they would get to the site, they would find the enemy was completely blowing up all of their tents and all of their equipment and retreating. It was nonsensical. They couldn't figure out why such confusion was occurring. Except that's what the Bible said would happen. Exodus 23:27 with the Jews. I will send my fear before you. I will cause confusion among all the people to whom you come and will make all your enemies to turn their backs to you. It was so bad before the war, Israel had prepared for mass slaughter, a Holocaust all over again. They designated national parks to be cemeteries, to bury the casualties. By the end of the war, they would not only push back their enemies to the north, to the east, and to the south, they would triple their territory. Oh, that's the complete opposite of what the Iraqi president declared before the war. He said this: the existence of Israel is an error which must be rectified. This is our opportunity to wipe out the disgrace which has been with us since 1948. Our goal is clear: to wipe Israel off the map. Ladies and gentlemen, the opposite occurred, as God would protect his people, which would give them back the very capital, which is biblical, known as Jerusalem, to which we are watching a war unfold over the Temple Mount. Same actors are in play. It's interesting. The world will come against Israel yet again. Ezekiel 38, as we are watching it unfold, is in play. Enemies to the north will come down. The same result of the 6-day war. God will fight the battles for his people. Verse 6. And in Shushan, the citadel, the Jews killed and destroyed 500 men. That's the main city, the capital of Persia. Verse 7. Also, Parshandatha, Dalphon, Aspatha, Puratha, I don't know how to pronounce any of these names, Adalia, Aridatha, Parmashta, Arisa, Aradai, and Vaesta. That might be a little bit of Spanish up in there. The 10 sons, who are these guys? The 10 sons of Haman, the son of Hammedatha, the enemy of the Jews they killed, but they did not lay a hand on the plunder. Okay, put that one line, they did not lay a hand on their plunder, in the back of your mind. These 10 sons of Haman are named specifically. And if you have access to the Hebrew manuscript, it's done in a very unique way. They actually break Hebrew syntax, which is a way of writing. You read it from the left to the right, and they go out of their way to list these 10 names, almost like a hit list. It's like they put it aside, like these guys. But also, it's shaped in a weird way. It almost looks like a gallows. But also, each of their names in Persian has the word self in it. So when Haman's naming his 10 sons, he adds the word self. So some of their names mean like self-assurance, self-righteousness, self-curious. Like, it's just interesting that Haman, the legacy he left within his children, was one of evil and selfishness. And we know in our own selves, in our own lives, our own sinfulness, it needs to be crucified. It needs to be dealt with. It needs to be killed. But there's some more significance to these names. Who are they? The sons of Haman, the son of Hammedatha. Remember, the Agagite. In other words, they were Amalekites. In Exodus chapter 17, verse 14, in Deuteronomy chapter 25, verses 17 to 19, God himself says, I will make war with the Amalekites from generation to generation until they are utterly destroyed. And then in 1 Samuel chapter 15, we were introduced to King Saul, the first king of Israel. He had an assignment that came down from the prophet on behalf of God. Destroy the Amalekites. Take none of the plunder. What does King Saul do? Bible students, he takes the plunder and he does not kill the king, King Agag. Many Bible scholars believe it was during that time period where King Agag either fathered an illegitimate child who would eventually have his blood, or there were other Amalekites or Agagites that got away. Either or, King Saul's disobedience would eventually yield a plague upon the people for years to come. So put this together. This is how amazing the Bible is. It's so fascinating. You got Saul, the son of Kish, from the tribe of Benjamin, failing at the task God assigned him, only for it to be completed by Mordecai, the son of Kish, the tribe of Benjamin. It's like God is saying, if you didn't do it, I'm going to have somebody else complete the task. But there's more significance to this. Haman, as we know it, is a type of Antichrist. In the Bible, there are certain individuals that are types of. It's biblical typology. It's really awesome when you begin to put these things together. The ark, for example, the ark with Noah is a type of salvation, like Christ and his life becoming an ark. Does that make sense? So you got Haman, who is a type of Antichrist. He's going to be anti-Jew or anti-God. He has 10 sons. So when you fast forward and you look at the scene or the landscape of the world when the actual Antichrist, the fulfillment of Haman and Hitler and every other evil ruler embodied in one, known as the Antichrist. You know how he rises to power? It says through 10 kings. Once again, the Bible is cluing us in. These insignificant names, 10 sons of Haman, eventually 10 kings will yield over their authority and their power for the Antichrist to rise and rule the world. In the 1940s, we know there was a Holocaust spearheaded by a type of Antichrist. His name was Hitler. Did you know there were several co-conspirators in the Nazi regime that were named? And as the trial was about to take place, several of them either had separate trials or were shipped out or had other circumstances that removed them from what we know as the international publicity around the Nuremberg trials, where they hung 10 of Hitler's closest henchmen. 10. No parallel between Esther and Hitler? Well, Julius Streicher, one of Hitler's main henchmen, expressed an awareness to this parallel with the events of Esther. As they were walking him to the gallows, he shouted, "Purim Fest, 1946. They're about to put a rope around his neck, and he yells out, Purim Fest, the feast where the Jews celebrate every year, commemorating the deliverance of the people from the tyrant named Haman and his sons. Not impressed yet? Another echo of Purim is found in the Soviet Union only a few years later. In January of 1953, then tyrant and dictator who was worshipped as a god king, Stalin, was in power. There was already anti-Semitic fervor throughout his empire in light of World War II. In January of that year, the propaganda mustered up what was called the Doctor's Plot, where they sought to try Jewish doctors, claiming or accusing them of a plot to assassinate Stalin and other Soviet Union leaders. It was all propaganda. It wasn't real. They arrest these Jews. They put them on display. So the entire country is saying these Jews were trying to take out what people believed to be a god king in the man named Stalin. And out of all the dates on the calendar, he set May 5th, 1953, for the day of that trial where they would be hung publicly. And then on May 6th, he would show the Jews that he cared about them. Because he said, people will probably retaliate based on these Jewish doctors, and I'm going to save them for national security. And on May 6th, his plan was to deport them to what he called safe camps. But they were really concentration camps. Unfortunately, for him, we're in March, not May. On March 1st, Stalin suffered a stroke. And then on March 5th, the day of the trial, he would die. By the way, March 1st was the night of Purim in 1953, where the Jews were celebrating their deliverance from Haman and his 10 sons. Charles Spurgeon nails it, speaking to the people of God. Their persecutions, slanders, falsehoods are like puffballs flung against a granite wall. They produce no result at all, for the Lord overrules the evil and brings good out of it. The best part of the quote, in my opinion, the cause of God is never in danger. Infernal craft is outwitted by infinite wisdom, and satanic malice held in check by boundless power. Charles Spurgeon. Psalm 7, 14-16 says it like this: Behold, the wicked brings forth iniquity. Yes, he conceives trouble. He's pregnant with trouble and brings forth falsehood. He gives birth to lies. He made a pit and dug it out and has fallen into the ditch which he made. His trouble shall return upon his own head, and his violent dealing shall come down on his own crown. An enemy of Israel is an enemy of God. And anyone that is governed by God, that is true for you as well. Verses 11-13, on that day, the number of those who were killed in Shushan, the citadel, was brought to the king. And the king said to Queen Esther, the Jews have killed and destroyed 500 men in Shushan, the citadel, and the 10 sons of Haman. What have they done in the rest of the king's provinces? Now, what is your petition? It shall be granted to you. Or what is your further request? It shall be done. In other words, these are called after-action reports. After a war, the casualty report comes in to the authority. It's the king. He finds out there are certain casualties in his province, the main city, Shushan. He then turns to Esther and says, listen, there's this many people killed, including the 10 sons of Haman. They're done. What else can I do for you? He's speaking to his queen. What else do you want to have me do? To which Esther said, if it pleases the king, let it be granted to the Jews who are in Shushan to do again tomorrow, according to today's decree, and let Haman's 10 sons be hanged on the gallows. Now, obviously, she's asking for one more day, specifically for the main city. Perhaps there were other conspiracies happening. They got word that there were still enemies. They were plotting to, come back and fight tomorrow. Esther's simply saying, hey, can we fight one more day in the main part of the kingdom just to put out the fires or put out the message that, we're going to exterminate anybody that's trying to do us harm. And by the way, King, can I also request the 10 sons of Haman being hung. And you're saying, and I'm saying, I thought they already died. They did. But it was very common in Persian culture to hang criminals in conspicuous places, like a wall. Now, when we say hanging here, it's not necessarily the gallows with a noose. It's a pole, and they're being impaled. And they're like advertisements to the community saying, this is what happens to anybody that violates the crown or sins against the crown or commits crimes against the crown. Now, people have said Esther was being vindictive or vengeful. She's gone too far. I don't think so. I think she understood the culture, but I also think she knew her Bible. Yeah, Deuteronomy 21:23. Their law said, cursed was anyone that was hung on a tree. It's a very obscure, random law in the book of Deuteronomy. Anybody that was hung on a pole, a tree, was accursed. Esther's making the case that Haman and his sons are cursed. Now, that's significant because out of all of the forms and fashions of execution to be chosen for the Son of God, the Lord found fit to ordain his son to be hung on a tree. To which Paul makes the connection for us, in case we're missing it. In Galatians 3:13, Paul writes this, Christ has redeemed us from the curse of the law, having become a curse for us, for it is written, pulls from Deuteronomy, cursed is everyone who hangs on a tree. And it's a verse like that that should help orient our hearts and minds around the depth of the sacrifice of the Son. That Haman's very sons are being displayed as curses, and Esther's making the application based on her Jewish law. And then Paul the apostle pulls from the Old Testament and writes what we know as the New Testament, making the case that Jesus himself became a curse so that you and I could become blessed. That's the gospel. In case any of us think our salvation was based on something we did, Christ became a curse. Christ became condemned so that we could become redeemed. Paul would again write to the church at Corinth, 2 Corinthians 5:21, for he made him who knew no sin, Jesus, to be sin, that we might become the righteousness of God in him. He became sin, my sin and your sin, so that we can become righteous. That equation should completely humble every person under the sound of my voice, that the one who was righteous became condemned so that the condemned, you and I, can become righteous. Like there it is, embedded, hidden, if you will, in the book of Esther, chapter 9, about Haman's sons being hung on a tree. And the Lord's like, yeah, even that should bring you into complete awe and wonder about what I did for you. Verses 14-16, so the king commanded this to be done. Okay, Esther, I'll do it. The decree was issued in Shushan, and they hanged Haman's 10 sons. And the Jews who were in Shushan gathered together again on the 14th day of the month of Adar and killed 300 men at Shushan. So the fighting continues the following day. But they did not lay a hand on the plunder. That's the second time that is mentioned. The remainder of the Jews in the king's provinces gathered together and protected their lives, had rest from their enemies, and killed 75,000 of their enemies. Do the math. There's 127 provinces. That's about 500 or 600 casualties in each province. That is not a small number. This is a civil war between the Jews and maybe even their allies, and obviously those that were anti-Semitic and haters of the people of God. And yet, the result, 75,000 of their enemies. But they did not lay a hand on the plunder. Second time in the span of 2 verses. This was on the 13th day of the month of Adar. On the 14th of the month, they rested and made a day of feasting and gladness. Now it's like an overview. What's happening? But the Jews who were at Shushan assembled together on the 13th day, as well as on the 14th, and on the 15th of the month, they rested and made it a day of feasting and gladness. We just got like a summary overview of what was happening. One day in the community at large, all the fighting. The next day they rested. Only in the main city, in Shushan, did they fight 2 days in a row. And then finally, on the 15th day of that month, rested. Therefore, the Jews of the villages who dwelt in the unwalled towns celebrated the 14th day of the month of Adar with gladness and feasting as a holiday for sending presents to one another. All right, so again, some of these verses are redundant, but again, it's documented to say, hey, this is how it happened, and then they celebrated. But I want to spend a moment looking at what was underlined on the screen, if you remember. And it's what I said earlier. I said, hey, put this in the back of your mind. Do you remember me saying that? 3 times in chapter 9, it says, and they did not take the plunder. Why is that significant? Because according to the decree in chapter 8, they were authorized to take the plunder. Haman's decree said, take the plunder, kill the Jews. Haman would have took the plunder and cashed in to pay the king. That was the bribe. So they copy and paste the decree and say to the Jews, defend yourselves, and oh, by the way, you can take the plunder. But it tells us, it goes out of the way to say they did not take the plunder, which tells you they were truly defending themselves. They were not doing any more and any less. But it also tells you something. It tells you that just because something is legal doesn't mean it's moral. I don't think I have to add any color commentary to that. Just because something is legal in our land, and everybody's doing it, and everybody's supporting it, and everybody's celebrating it, and everybody's parading it, does not make it biblical or moral. To which the church for too long has parroted or echoed the culture and affirmed it, as opposed to saying, no, I will not compromise truth. Just because it's legal does not mean it's moral. Now we move rather quick to the end. And Mordecai wrote these things and sent letters to all the Jews near and far who were in all the provinces of King Ahasuerus to establish among them that they should celebrate yearly the 14th and 15th days of the month of Adar as the days on which the Jews had rest from their enemies, as the month which was turned from sorrow to joy for them and from mourning to a holiday, that they should make them days of feasting and joy, of sending presents to one another and gifts to the poor. Now, this is after the aftermath, the cleanup, the assessment, the action reports have come in. And this is when the follow-up letters go out. Mordecai writes all of the Jews and says, hey, based on what occurred those past few days, these specific days, we are going to celebrate them every year. And they celebrate it every year, even today. Jews around the world, around the month of March, maybe sometimes in the beginning of April, depends on where it falls on the calendar, they celebrate the Feast of Purim. And it's like our Halloween. Kids dress up like Mordecai and Esther and some even Haman, and they act it out. And every time Haman's name is mentioned, the people boo and hiss. And every time Mordecai's name is mentioned, people applaud and celebrate. It's like, to this day, in fact, next year, Purim 2023 will be on March 7th, which was the exact day when it occurred in Esther 9, March 7th, which, if you know my testimony, is a date of great significance. So on March 7th, they waited because the decree of death was looming. And on that same day, the decree of life won out. March 7th for me in 2009 became a day of death as well. I was responsible for the at-fault drunk driving fatality of a man named Hort Cap, a father of children. And of course, every year as I am working my way through the calendar, March 7th is always in the back of my mind. It's an anniversary, and if you have those types of anniversaries, you already know. 12 years had gone by as I entered 2021. The only difference was my wife was pregnant as we entered that year. We were due towards the end of February, and I knew the 12th anniversary of March 7th was upon us. Well, her due date came and went, and she was frustrated, as you can imagine, wanting this baby out of her as quick as possible. And everybody told us it was the second child that was going to come exactly on the due date, but the due date came and the due date went. And then March 1st quickly turned to March 3rd. And then March 3rd quickly turned to March 5th. And then March 5th to March 6th. And her water breaks, and I take her to the hospital. And then it was the early hours of March 6th, and I'm watching the clock on the wall all day long. And it began to go forward an hour. And I remember looking at it into the afternoon, into the early evening, into the late evening, and eventually 11 o'clock p.m., and eventually 11:59 turned to 12 midnight. And I looked at my Apple Watch where the digital number 6 turned over to number 7. And I remember thinking, out of all the days, God just turned a death day into a birthday. And it was on March 7th where we gave birth to my son, Ezekiel. And when I thought about that, as it completely humbled me, similar to Esther 9 and this complete reversal from death to life, and I realized for all of us, it's exactly what occurs when we look at Jesus Christ on the cross. If you come to Christ on the cross, that's a death day. Your life for his life. And if you believe what he accomplished on that cross, that death day becomes a birthday. You become born again. And all because of a death day in the Son of God's life. It's the gospel. Verses 23 to 25. Again, it's a recap with some specific details about the day. So the Jews accepted the custom which they had begun as Mordecai had written to them, because Haman, the son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, the enemy of all the Jews, had plotted against the Jews to annihilate them and had cast pur, there it is, that is the lot, to consume them and destroy them. But when Esther came before the king, he commanded by letter that this wicked plot which Haman had devised against the Jews should return on his own head, and that he and his son should be hanged on the gallows. There it is, Proverbs 16:33. The lot is cast into the lap, but every decision is from the Lord, which means God may not overrule something, but God rules over everything. That's the promise. Verses 26 to 28. So they called these days Purim, after the name Pur. Therefore, because of all the words of this letter, what they had seen concerning this matter, and what had happened to them, the Jews established and imposed it upon themselves and their descendants and all who would join them, that's you and I, that without fail, they should celebrate these 2 days every year according to the written instructions and according to the prescribed time, that these days should be remembered and kept throughout every generation, every family, every province, and every city, that these days of Purim should not fail to be observed among the Jews, and that the memory of them should not perish among their descendants. That's happening. Okay, there are 7 Jewish holidays appointed by God. That's Leviticus chapter 23. They're all listed in Leviticus 23. The whole chapter is designated to learning about these festivities or these holidays. There's 7, that's God's number. There are 2 additions that were man instituted. One is Purim, which has stood the test of time. The second is what we call Hanukkah. Hanukkah came, the kingdom after the Persian Empire was the Grecian Empire. And another man like Haman before him, his name was Antiochus Epiphanes. He too tried to slaughter the Jews. He's the one that went into the temple and sacrificed a pig and made the priests drink the blood. It's where we get the term the abomination of desolation, which Jesus said will happen again with the final Antichrist. That is what made Judas Maccabees rise up and overthrow that type of tyrannical behavior to which the Jews celebrated their Declaration of Independence called Hanukkah. Those are the 2 instituted festivals plus the 7. Why is that important? Well, I would make the case that every Christian should know about them. First things first, it was the Jews who gave us the scriptures. It was through the Jews that we were given the Savior. Jesus is a Jew. Jesus does not have blonde hair. He did not have blue eyes, unbeknownst to me. Jesus was a Jew. The early disciples were Jewish. The first missionaries around the world, Jews. Jesus died on a Jewish holiday known as Passover. Jesus got up from that grave 3 days later on another Jewish holiday known as the Feast of First Fruits. Jesus promised his Holy Spirit would fall upon his church 50 days to the date on another holiday known as Pentecost. Salvation is from the Jews, John 4:22. And every Christian should have a working handle and knowledge of these Jewish holidays because they have great significance in light of Jesus and the church. And I might even venture to say the Feast of Trumpets might have some type of relation to Jesus' return. But that's another lesson. Then Queen Esther, the daughter of Abihail, with Mordecai the Jew, wrote with full authority to confirm the second letter about Purim. And Mordecai sent letters to all the Jews, to the 127 provinces of the kingdom of Ahasuerus, with words of peace and truth, to confirm these days of Purim at their appointed time, as Mordecai the Jew and Queen Esther had prescribed for them, and as they had decreed for themselves and their descendants concerning matters of their feasting and lamenting. So the decree of Esther confirmed these matters of Purim, and it was written in the book. It almost seems redundant and over, but if you caught what was said in these final few verses, the words that went forth from the kingdom by Mordecai, a righteous man in a position of power that God elevated him to, were words of peace and truth, true peace, a peace that only God could supply. Not fake peace, not pseudo peace, no, a true peace. There was peace throughout the land and in the souls of man because of righteous policies and righteous behaviors and righteous actions. And oh yeah, by the way, it was the truth, and the word means stability. There was a stability in the kingdom to which previously it was unstable because of Haman. What's my point? My point is this. If the church understands their role, that we're to hold forth the torch of truth in our world, this is where the world will find the peace that they're longing for with God. And this is what stabilizes the soul and society that we are currently in. How do you get that? Well, you hold to it. And truth holds you. Truth held leads to you being held. Said in a different way, truth holds those who hold truth. Truth stabilizes the soul that holds to truth. Nothing in the world can throw you off when you hold to truth. And the truth has a name. It's Jesus Christ. So with all these lessons in the book of Esther, with the reversal of the devil's plot through Haman, we see it again through Hitler. It's going to eventually come again in the end time scenario, and yet the church should be in their right place at their right time, like a statue of liberty, pointing people to the one true king. That's Esther chapter 9, silent sovereignty. And since we're not dead, we're not done. We've heard it. By God's grace, let's do it. Let me pray. So Lord, in heaven, we submit the needs of our hearts to you. We confess the name above all names, Jesus, as a way to bring peace to our own souls, but also to bring stability. You are the only constant. You are a providential God. You are perfect in all your ways. The way we learn how you've recycled all of the plots of the enemy and the evil, and yet even the cross exclaims, the devil's best attempt is the greatest backfire. That death led to life, and then you became a curse so that we can become blessed. I pray your people would recognize and realize that. It begins with us first. So to that end, we praise. And in that name we pray, the name of Jesus. Amen.